You've done a lot of research sort of real time during this crisis, but you looked at sort of the different sort of the exodus, the mobility of the city by class, by borough. What are the sort of key findings, and why do you think is sort of an important indicator of something to learn from this crisis?
Thanks so much for having me on the show. So we used mobile phone data provided by VanPath to understand how many New Yorkers actually left the city and when did they do that. And so we find that as of the middle of July or so, about 15 to 20% of the population of Manhattan has actually left. This is a really striking aspect of migration that we're seeing in response to COVID that really dwarfs previous patterns and kind of shows the possible vulnerability of cities in the wake of pandemics such as this.
So I'm just curious, though, here, Arpit. I mean, there is a lot of evidence here that people are leaving or at least relocating. There's also some evidence here that some of that could be temporary. The idea here that I guess once you do finally get past the COVID crisis, there's a vaccine or at least some assurances about safety, that these offices will fill back up and these apartment buildings will fill back up. Is there any evidence that you're seeing statistically that would support that?
Absolutely. So I think the cities that so far seem hardest hit do include New York as well as San Francisco. And some hard evidence that we can look to point at that would be evidence on real estate prices, which do seem to be slower in these major cities relative to others. So for many other cities around the country, we haven't really seen the same real estate impact as in the largest, most expensive cities, which would suggest that the more permanent moves are more likely to be contained within those largest urban areas.
You know, it's obviously an extraordinary exodus that we've seen, and of course, we'll know maybe over the coming months how much of it was temporary, people going to some other place versus a permanent move. But I'm curious in your view, I mean, we already know that a lot of people had been leaving for cheaper areas and that some of these cities that are booming, like whether Nashville or Austin or Denver, these were hot areas prior. Do you have a sense of like how much this is just new behavior versus, say, pulling forward moves that might have happened over the next 5 years anyway?
I think you're absolutely right. A lot of these moves, whether they're further out into the suburbs or towards these fast-growing Sunbelt areas, are likely pulled forward demand. However, even that would have a stark change in how cities actually function. So even in the 70s and 80s period, for instance, we saw some parts of that pulled forward demand really change how cities actually function. And it's possible that those changes in the future would also make a drastic difference to what it's like to live in New York on a day-to-day basis.
So, Arpit, I think it's fair to say that all three of us sort of live very fortunate lives. And when we talk about the ability to move, there are a lot of us who can sort of pick up and choose where we want to live. There are a lot of people out there in New York City who don't necessarily have the financial means to be able to do that. And I'm wondering if you have a city where the only people sort of left behind are lower income workers and workers who are unemployed or people who simply just have fewer options, what kind of city does that leave?
I think you're right that this pandemic is highlighting the inequalities in a much starker way than we've seen previously. And what we find in our research is that workers that are staying behind are more likely to be essential workers and people that continue to commute to the workplace, which exposes them to greater risk of actually contracting COVID.
So obviously we're talking right now about the stimulus, and one of the big sticking points is this idea of aid to cities and states. And of course, the Democrats are much more for it. Republicans are much more skeptical. For New York right now, how pivotal is this? I mean, is this a situation where if New York can get a big infusion of aid, then it can maintain essential services and sort of halt the exodus? And if they don't, then it could be the kind of exodus that really becomes self-sustaining, leading to damage for a long time to come?
I think there is a risk of that negative spiral because the city for a couple decades now has really relied on those wealthier individuals who have delayed and postponed those moves to the suburbs, which has provided the tax base on which we've been able to provide essential public services. And as more people leave, these services, as you say, will be cut back in ways that will encourage more and more people to also leave the city. So we may end up with a city that is comprised more of young people, which may be good for the city in various ways, but without that same level of tax base, it's going to find it harder to kind of support that high income population.
So then this brings the government back into focus, the city councils, and to some extent the state governments as well. And I guess what some people see as potential competition kind of arising, the idea that certain governments that have more favorable tax schemes or better city services might be able to attract people at the expense of others.
Yeah, I think that would be very healthy competition. And those other cities are going to find that with new availability of work from home, they're going to be able to attract different kinds of workers than they were able to previously. So I think that's very healthy competition across the country.
So what are the next areas? I mean, like I said, I've been on Twitter, you track a lot of different things. You've been sort of looking at the economic impacts of this crisis from the beginning. What are the key areas right now that you think policymakers need to get a handle on in terms of both the economic impact of this crisis as well as the health impact when thinking about the next set of policies, be they at the federal level or the municipal level?
I think two key areas. One of them would be the local government angle that we mentioned before. I think the other thing that I'm watching very closely is what happens to commercial real estate, because we all know that many aspects of commercial real estate have been hit very badly in this crisis. We've seen large waves of delinquencies among tenants, and we're not quite sure where that's actually going to lead to. Are we going to see more foreclosures? What's going to happen to commercial real estate in general? I think this is going to be a very critical area to watch.
And when you talk about looking at commercial real estate, I mean, you're primarily looking at, I guess, people who are going into offices, or you're looking at commuting data, or is there more, or can you sort of look more at some of the retail side spending equation and get a better sense of maybe whether we are, I guess, actively participating in this city and this economy?
Yeah, it's about all the major food groups of commercial real estate. So office, retail, apartment buildings, industrial, lodging, and so forth. So we've seen a huge divergence even within commercial real estate across these different areas. So multifamily and offices are doing much better, whereas retail and lodging are doing much worse.